on Smooth 98.1.
All right, studio is live. Mics are up.
I invest where money never sleeps.
Good morning, Lagos, and thank you for staying with us. You're tuned in and listening to Smooth 98.1, Smooth Breakfast with Ayo.
And Valentine.
And this morning, inside of Freshly Pressed 981, to analyze the stories with us, we have joining us Cheta Nwaeze. He's at Chicksta on Twitter. Good morning, Cheta.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. And Nnamdi Eke is at Nnamdi Eke on Twitter. Good morning.
Good morning. Arsenal is winning. Clean sheets. Good morning.
Fantastic. Thank you. And also expected in the studio in a few seconds, we have Ikemesit Effiong. His handle is at Judge Ike. Thank you, Lagos, for joining us. And Ikemesit just walked in. Hi, Ikemesit. Good morning.
Hey, morning.
Good morning, Kevin.
Good morning. All those millions
When I was
you're counting, eh?
when I was growing up, they used to flog latecomers.
This one is big pin. So let's get into the stories. But Lagos, be reminded that you can send in messages through Twitter. The hashtag is Freshly Pressed 91. On WhatsApp, our number is
0809 444 0981. That's 0809 444 0981.
and on YouTube we're streaming live. So please join us in the live stream. Also subscribe to our channel, and you can leave a comment there on YouTube as well. youtube.com/smooth91FM Lagos.
All right, we go on to our first story, and this is from the Vanguard newspaper. Cheta, I'll start with you. Extrajudicial killings. Police opt for stun guns. Now, in recent times, we've reported with the case of Kolade Johnson yesterday's unfortunate incident with Adobe and Emmanuel. And responding to this, Acting Inspector General of Police, Mr. Mohammed Adamu, yesterday in Lagos, said that henceforth, the nation's policemen will start using stun guns for routine patrols because the police under the current leadership can no longer tolerate abuses associated with the police. He also mentioned a few other reforms he's looking to implement in the police force. Can you please take us through this story quickly?
Well, the acting inspector general has told us what he has in mind, given the problems of the police. But I fear that his solutions, the stun guns and all of that, doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the problem. I mean, one symptom of the problem with the police, for example, is that pretty much every inspector general of the police since we transited back to democracy in '99 has given the order that roadblocks on the highways be dismantled. The only one who, to my memory, has not given that order is Mohammed Adamu, who is the acting IG at the moment.
Yes.
And the roadblocks never get dismantled. I mean, they remain there. What that tells me is that there's a breakdown in the chain of command, and that policemen are no longer listening to their superiors. Now, about this stun gun thing,
Yes,
it's an identification of so he has identified the fact that the men under his command have a propensity for violence. They have a propensity to raise their weapons, but there are some practical problems. So we have 371,800 policemen as of the last figures released in 2016. The Saber tactical stun gun costs the equivalent of 15,000 naira. That's if you are buying it off the shelf. In the US, we've not talked about importation cost and all of that.
Yeah.
So if we are just buying it off the shelf, it will cost about 5.4 billion naira. The proposed police budget for 2019 is 30 billion naira, and don't forget that in November last year, the president approved a new pay structure for the police, which essentially doubled their salaries.
Yeah.
So I'd like to ask questions of how will all of this fit into the existing budgets. Then,
I mean, let me just
Okay.
interrupt just a second. Now, it's not a new concept. Indeed, the former Inspector General of Police, Solomon Arashe, was the first to introduce stun guns. And it's interesting, as this report reminds us, what the procedure was. And I wonder why that was stopped, because what the arrangement was number one, stun guns would be used at checkpoints, and then a few meters down the line, some police officers will have.
it was stopped because of practicalities of things like charging, that kind of stuff. There's this little thing called NEPA that I think you're familiar with the concepts. So anyway,
You mean
practicalities.
Go on.
Neither, guys, neither.
Go on, Cheta.
NEPA, practicalities have stood in the way, and it's not just, those are not just the only issues, but the real issue with the Nigerian police, some of these issues are being tackled in the police reform bill that was introduced by Senator Bala Naala, which has not yet been signed, not yet been passed.
Yeah.
The real issues are things like the structure of the police, training for the police, welfare for the policemen. Those are the real issues. These are things that need to be tackled. I mean, a 30,000 volt stun gun, for example, if improperly used, will still kill people anyway. So when you have people who are very short-tempered and have a high propensity for violence, simply replacing the guns that they have with another set of guns does not necessarily solve the problem.
All right, thank you very much indeed for that. Nnamdi, I'll come to you for this one. Now we'll go from Lagos, the statement made in Lagos State, to Abuja. Now, Guardian reports that again, Abuja locals protest against land takeover, shutdown activities in FCT. Very interesting story. We'll take the details. But can you please just touch on it and then give us your thoughts on it?
I mean, it's interesting that the first story spoke about insecurity, widespread killings, extrajudicial killings, because this story addresses a protest by what these papers are calling indigenes of Tungamaje village in Anagada, Gwagwalada. Well, I mean, I've taken a little slight issue with the word indigene because I assume we're all indigenes of the Federal Republic of Nigeria. But anyway, I think they mean the villagers, people who can trace their ancestry back a few years, the ones who are actually resident in Tungamaje. They were protesting the invasion of their homelands by soldiers. The story doesn't really get too explicit as to the reasons for that invasion, but it does state that they camped outside the FCT ministry, causing a traffic gridlock for between 3 hours and 5 hours, depending on which source you choose. There's also the report of one of these Tungamaje indigenes, in quote, being killed. His name is Hamza Usman, he's a student. He was killed because he was protesting the ill treatment meted out by the security forces. This story is very, very concerning because according to the report, attempts by the FCT Commissioner of Police, Bala Churuma, to placate the protesters was unsuccessful, which makes sense because if you've seen one of yours killed, about 4 others injured, without proper explanation as to why they're destroying their crops and their livelihood and their homes, then you will understand their outcry. Ultimately, there is some talk of closed-door meetings to try to negotiate and mediate the peace. But beyond that, not much else is discussed. But it's a thorny issue in Nigeria, really, where you have security forces barging into particular locales for one reason or the other. There have been incidences in Lagos, but in those cases, it was in cases of how do you put it? Failing to compensate for the expropriation of property. Yeah. So I mean, it's not an unusual issue, but this particular one doesn't have enough explanation as to exactly why soldiers, members of the military forces, were in Tungamaji, and we pray for the soul of Hamza Usman.
Yes, according to reports from this story, it's not the first time, and that's why the people have come out to say enough is enough. We're not taking it anymore. They can't come in here and forcefully take our lands and take over our crops as well. All right, we'll take some comments before we go on to the next story.
All right. This one is coming in from, what's your name here? Benga Kamu actually sent this one. It says there's a lacuna between the police hierarchy, what the police hierarchy says and what their men do. The footmen of the Nigerian police pay no heed to what the top men say. It is frightening. Another message here from Freda. Freda says, so in summary, the IGP believes the issue is in the guns and not the mindset of the force. Let's deep dive intelligently for once and address what really needs to be addressed. And Shayi here says, sack all the policemen and recruit new and fresh minds. That's the only reform that they can implement in that sector. Yinka says, stun guns for the police is not a bad one, but as Cheta said, in Nigeria, stun gun can still kill. last Friday on my way home at around 6 p.m. thereabouts. Those rugged-looking policemen. He says his code name was Eagle Eye Squad, wearing a danfo painted in police color, as you have to be aware of the surrounding when driving. I looked at them, and then the next thing I was pulled over, and the searching began at K2 Expressway. My colleague was asked to unlock his phone, and all at the bottom line, when I asked why the student stopped, they said they were suspecting my colleague. Just like that. The police need training, period.
Thank you very much for sharing that, Yinka. I'm moving away from that story. Go on to another one. Ikemesit, I'll come to you for this. Nigerian activist jailed 7 years for falsely accusing public official of corruption. Now, his name is Ibrahim Wala, popularly called IG Wala, and he was jailed yesterday by Justice Yusuf Halilu of the High Court of the FCT. A number of things that he's been found guilty of. Ikemesit, can you please highlight them and let us know what you think?
Yeah, so the charges that he was found guilty of include unlawful assembly, public incitement, and criminal defamation of character. Essentially, what the court found was that first, Mr. Wala used his Facebook page to quote unquote incite the public against Mr. Mukhtar, who's the chairman of the National Hajj Commission of Nigeria. Mr. Wala had, in fact, alleged that Mr. Mukhtar, in his position as NACOM boss, had made 3 billion naira for himself from organizing the 2017 Hajj operations. He had claimed on social media that he had documents to prove his allegation, but the judge said that over the course of the trial, he failed to tender such documents, and because of that, Mr. Mukhtar's petition alleging criminal defamation of his character was going to stand. So there are two ways to look at this, narrowly and more expansively. Narrowly in terms of the facts of the case, and I think there's no reason to assume that the courts didn't do the proper job in this case. If it did indeed find that there was no substantive evidence to back this allegation, and in the narrow sense of these two parties involved in this matter, it reached the appropriate decision. Okay.
The first one about unregistered organization.
Okay. Yes. The court said that he also found out that Mr. Wala's organization, the Citizens Action to Take Back Nigeria, is an unregistered organization, and there are rules in the country around unregistered organizations not being allowed to meet. So ab initio, any assembly of an unregistered organization is unlawful, especially if they are gathered for a civic or a citizenship participation purpose.
Forgive me, I know I'm not a legal person, so you are. But is there not a standing Supreme Court judgment regarding free assembly?
So, I mean, if I can just jump in here. First of all, I think this story might have been misreported, and the allegation would probably have been that the protest was unregistered with the Commissioner of Police. They failed to get a permit. But there's definitely a constitutional guarantee for free assembly, the freedom of assembly. They have that fundamental right.
I remember that there was such a case in 2014, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court.
There is even a 2007 case, ANPP and Inspector General of Police. That's a 2008 Court of Appeal case, which indicates that you can organize a protest without obtaining a police permit.
Exactly.
Okay. So that's that. I think, for me, generally, to the larger point, which deals with free speech, right? This is where probably this case might be a bit concerning. You might have a situation where this empowers, especially those who have access to the political levers of power, to essentially, brandish petitions against people who make allegations as well. So the question has to be, where do we draw the line between, what you can say about people who occupy positions of power and positions of privilege, and rightly should be called out, and rightly we should demand accountability from, without skirting the lines of defaming character. I think that this particular case does not particularly resolve.
Thank you very much indeed for that. You can read details of that with what he has been accused of and what he's been sentenced for in the Premium Times. Now, going on to New Telegraph, Cheta, I have this story. The Premium Times also actually has a fuller description in terms of a special report on this, but New Telegraph has an update, and that is that the Lagos State University
New Telegraph has a press release.
Well, it starts a special report now because it's more detailed and it's
No,
almost like an
Premium
investigation.
Times is a special report. New Telegraph is a press release.
Okay.
Let me
All
just
right.
go
New
into it.
Telegraph says LASU dismisses alleged diversion of pension funds. So take us through this press release, as you said.
I mean, very lazy journalism. Let's just go straight to Premium Times. And Premium Times did a special report where they talked about how the management of LASU dipped into the pension funds and bought some really choice cars: Toyota Corolla 1.8 GLI, CVT ATS LS luxury model,
Okay,
63 million naira. No, I'm looking at it and my mouth is
No,
watering.
let people go
Um,
and read the cars.
Okay.
details, yeah.
Basically, the Premium Times report, again very detailed,
Mhm.
pointed out that a lot of LASU staff do not have pension fund accounts, and because of that, the management was able to kind of like break the law actually, and deep into because they deduct their contributions to the CPS at source, but so the money is just sitting there. They don't remit it to any PFAs, and as a result, the kind of like putting the pool of milk before the cats and expecting the cats to be a good cat, not really going to happen. And so the last two guys have done a press release where they said where they denied, of course, which is the typical thing. But for me, it's typical Nigerian reaction. So you know who made you call it it's an allegation. It's Premium Times. They're probably one of the best investigative reporters in Nigeria, Nicholas Ibekwe. If you really think that he's wrong or that he's lying, don't just issue a press release and hope that it will all go away, because that's what we typically do.
Yeah.
Sue for, because this is a serious issue.
It's 198 million.
198 million naira is not beans by any stretch of the imagination. You can give me that to go and run for election.
Funny, Cheta, funny. On Twitter, we have comments. Now, Zubi Emodi sent in this one. It says, the way they will abuse those stun guns there, reacting to the police suggestion, the IG of police suggesting they use stun guns instead of real guns. It says, only God can save us. They just need to be trained on people management and punished severely when they derail. He adds, hey, why do you have dreadlocks? Zzz. Hey, why are you looking at my name? Zzz. Hey, what's in your boot? Zzz. Sad alternative.
If that's the same Zubi and Modi, I know, shout out.
We have more messages here.
He's as big as you, so they will stun him well.
I hope not. Owama Chigo's here at this one. It says people are now afraid of the Nigerian police than armed robbers. The rate at which the police are killing innocent people, if not checked, people may seek to help themselves. The processes of recruitment to training, welfare of police should be urgently reviewed. Meanwhile, let judgment be served on the murderers, he said, those accused allegedly, without delay. Owama, thank you very much for your message.
Lulu from VI says the mentality that makes it possible for a policeman to shoot an unarmed person is what should be dealt with, not the tool used to implement the murderous mentality. The police can carry clubs and people will still be killed if the mentality issue isn't dealt with.
Let's move on to this next story from Premium Times. Nigeria processing applications for 303 new private universities.
I mean, even
I expected a round of applause, but alas, none is coming.
even the exclamation in your voice.
Honestly.
Because it was about 3 months ago, we were a bit alarmed when we heard that 4 more universities, private universities, were accredited and added to the pool of 74, now making it 78. We have all these ones, 303, about 20.79% is haven't passed the first stage of accreditation, which means their sites haven't been supervised or really seen and accredited, and only 2 applicants so far have passed through the 8th stage. But take us through this story, Nnamdi.
Right. So, I mean, I don't want to go into any trivial analysis of the number of universities in Nigeria compared to other territories in the world and all of that, but it would be remiss of me not to point out that perhaps we have too many tertiary institutions springing up in Nigeria, and you have to question the credibility.
Yeah, so quantity over quality.
Exactly, and then there's also the question of diluting the actual pool. So what happens when you have more universities providing substandard education And what does that do to people who actually go to good schools in Nigeria and come out? What's the perception internationally? But leaving all of that aside again, I'm just going to point out that 303 applications doesn't mean 303 new universities. There are 14 stages, 14 steps. And according to this report, only 63 applicants are on step 6, 30 applicants on step 8, and 2, as you mentioned earlier, are on step 10, which means there's still 4 more stages before they get a provisional license. That provisional license entitles you to operate for 3 years on a probationary basis, and there's no guarantee that you carry on after that time. So it does sound like the process has some rigor, some stringency to it. But I think just generally, I'm going to make a comment. This story does report about academic corruption. The registrar of the Joint Admissions and Matriculation Board, Ishaq Oloyede, accused Nigerian private universities of aiding academic corruption. He hasn't really been too clear on what that means, but I'm going to assume that, as you said earlier on, it's provision of substandard education while running the universities as a private or family business, using it just to make money. And that does concern me a little bit. I don't think there's too much more to say there. I think Cheta wants to.
Yeah, last week UNESCO released a list of top African destinations for international students. Nigeria is not in the top 10.
I think Ghana was number 1, right?
No, South Africa was number 1, Ghana was number 2.
Oh.
Here's what killed me. The Democratic Republic of Congo is number 10. DRC, that they have been fighting since God talked to Moses, is above Nigeria. I mean, that tells you everything you need to know.
So that tells you really what the best kind of investment should be in the people, not necessarily just infrastructure. Well, let's move on now to talk some more stories, share some more stories. This one is related, education still. Premium Times, Nigerians do not need WAEC certificate to become president. Who says this is the Festus Keyamo, who's the spokesperson of the All Progressives Congress, APC. He mentioned this in a tweet, but I want you to take us through the story, Ikemesit.
Indeed. So essentially what Festus Keyamo said was, and he, consulted Section 3181 of the Constitution, which, when you think about it and you think about the hoopla that surrounded the entire conversation around whether the president is qualified to run for office or not, makes it feel like they just discovered that particular section of the Constitution. So essentially what that section provides, and this was essentially what it worked through, was that if you do not necessarily need a WAEC certificate. The wording of the Constitution,
it says school certificate,
yes,
or
it
its
says
equivalent.
School certificate or its equivalent, and there are actually a couple of other requirements, right? So it's secondary school certificate or its equivalent, or an education up to secondary school certificate level, or a primary 6 school leaving certificate or its equivalent, and any other qualifications acceptable by INEC. So essentially what Professor Keyamo was saying was that the president at least went to primary school, WAEC after the fact presented a certificate to him, and even if WAEC didn't, that was sufficient for him. And INEC says, he speaks good English, and that's acceptable by us, which begs the question, why wasn't this clarified at the point where this conversation started, right? We've essentially waited till the beginning of his second term.
No, it hasn't started.
Well, okay,
2019.
the eve of his second term, right? And it seems like there's this low-key revisionist campaign to, brush up the credentials. And I don't mean credentials only in an educational sense,
Low-key,
but sort of in a leadership competence sense of the president. It feels very banal.
Interesting. Thank you, Ikemesit. We encourage you to go through Premium Times to read this story. Also, we have messages on YouTube. We're going to get to that in a short bit, but let's go to this next story from the Punch newspaper. Nnamdi, I'll come to you for this. The federal government's probe panel recommends NHIS boss sacking. So the panel that was set up as a copy of this presented a copy of the report, and it was retrieved by reporters or received by reporters. According to the panel, they accused Yusuf, that's the Professor Usman Yusuf, the executive secretary of the agency NHIS, that's the Nigerian Health Insurance Scheme, of abusing his office, breaching the Public Procurement Act as well as public service rules, also underscoring some of his discrepancies relating to his not, I'm looking for better terms to describe this. The way
Yeah, yeah.
it does not deal very well with the staff.
Yeah,
But take us through this.
Said failure to have a healthy relationship with members of staff or whatever. This story is one of the most interesting today, and it's definitely the most interesting I've been asked to handle. But first of all, I just want to make a sideways comment at Chief Festus Keyamo SAN and his particular spin on school certificates. I think that's extremely glib. I don't want to go too far into that.
All right, let's
But
get
yeah,
to this story.
that made me a little mad. Anyway, this particular story.
I mean, he's into making those
Glib
of us in the
comments.
You
profession.
guys have 3 minutes.
Sorry, so this particular story is interesting. First of all, because I recall earlier on in this particular program, we discussed IG Wala, who was sentenced to 7 years
Right.
for leading a protest. And for criminal defamation of character, where he said somebody made 3 billion naira for himself.
And
Now
let-
we have
reflect
this.
on this fact.
We have this particular
Mhm.
gentleman now, Professor Usman Yusuf, who used to be, well, he still is, even though he's been suspended, the executive secretary of the National Health Insurance Scheme. He's been accused of breaching the Public Procurement Act. But the report of a 7-man committee headed by Dr. Hassan Bukar, which has been looking into his particular offenses, has recommended that he not be prosecuted
Yes.
at all.
They said they did not recommend
Yes.
this is for prosecution.
Now-
I find it interesting that they included that clause there.
Exactly. Now let's go into exactly what they've accused him of. The report read: relieve the executive secretary of the appointment, justification, inability to work in harmony with all the relevant stakeholders in the scheme for the attainment of the scheme's mandate. Established cases of infractions of the public service rules, that is insubordination and refusal to carry out lawful instruction from superior authorities.
So substantial stuff.
Contrary to PSR Rule 030301, or unauthorized public utterances, contrary to Rule 030421. Now, this is the interesting bit, because apparently he said in public in an interview with The Punch in 2017, F, choose the other 3 letters at your own peril,
Wow.
the Minister of Health. This is the report. It's quite interesting. Now,
Very interesting.
my second bone of contention is that he was actually suspended. So sorry to take the time, in November last year, because he had sued the Minister of Health and a number of other authorities for his dismissal actually seems to be predicated on the fact that he sued the Minister of Health, raising the question of whether they had the authority to actually discipline him, and he went to the courts of justice, went to a competent
So
court.
invariably asking your
Chiku
boss, why
BSA.
yes, do you
No,
have
no,
the
no.
right to punish me or something?
He actually had a point. He went through. He went by the existing laws. He felt that he was being disciplined unfairly, and he said, "Listen, I'm sorry, you don't have this authority. Let's change this."
All right,
And
now
on the
this-
strength of that,
Yes.
on the strength of that, he has now been pulled up and recommended for dismissal. I think it should make public servants and civil servants shiver if they feel that you are handcuffed. You can no longer go through the usual processes available for Nigerians simply because you work for the Nigerian government.
Alas, no punitive measures, but let's keep it going. The last story we'll touch on very, very briefly. Ikemesit, please. Emitters, electricity consumers to pay through service charge. Before now, we were told we're not going to pay free of charge. Now, according to the meter asset providers, now they're saying there's a caveat to that, but please.
Yeah. So when you consider the fact that according to these reports, the current metering gap is about 4.7 million, so 4.7 million people that should have meters don't have it, and the discos think that number will significantly increase when a proper enumeration exercise happens, considering the fact that 30% of this is planned to be locally sourced, considering the fact that this was a significant issue and the discos have been complaining of funding issues. Why were we ever given the impression that we were not going to pay for this? I mean, it was pretty obvious to even a casual observer of the sector that we were either going to pay for the cost of ramping up infrastructure and then probably deal with the sector of higher power bills, which a lot of consumers might not mind if it is guaranteed that we'll get good services. Why didn't they lead with this in the first
So I
place?
did not have light for 2 weeks out of last month, and I got a bill of over 60,000 naira.
You were charged for
Yeah,
darkness now.
you're
It's
Are
a
you
normal
operating
thing
a
now.
factory?
Your
I was
house
going
now.
to say, you have a
You
factory in
forgot
your
it.
house.
All
All right,
right.
let's quickly go to some comments before we call it. Just one or two. Oben says, I wish the story had said 303 companies to commence operations as in regards to the
Universities,
stories.
private universities.
Also, we have Agogo Sam here who says that even primary and secondary schools should go through hurdles should have 14 or 15 steps to scale to before they're allowed to operate.
All right.
So many schools on every street in Lagos today.
Thank you very much to our analyst Cheta at Checkster on Twitter, that's CHXTA. Judge Ike is Ikemesit Effiong. Nnamdi Awa Kalu is by the same name on Twitter. Special thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. Coming up next, we talk entertainment inside of the grapevine.